Right, next we move on to another call to the believers, and this is a very famous one, which is always quoted. O ye who believe, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, ati'u Allah, obey the messenger, and those in charge among you, wa ulil amri minkum. So, in this particular passage, which is verse 59 to verse 70, we have the believers being given their command structure. And here the messenger is meant to be taken as a judge and meant to be obeyed. So another famous verse is verse 65, which is in there, which says that you cannot be considered to be a believer unless you accept the messenger's judgment without any kind of hesitation. So here the command structure of the believers is vital for the activation of that system, which I mentioned in verse 47 to 58. Next, once you have the command structure, next comes the passage 71 to 93, which talks about the believers' expeditionary strategy. That is how the believers are supposed to move. They also have a social philosophy, which is fighting in the way of Allah, which is to liberate people. Once again, fighting in the way of Allah is to liberate people, is to give them the freedom to choose. It's not meant to oppress them. And it also talks about the good and bad events, which is in verses 78 to 79, because things will happen to you during that period. Yeah, and that's when Allah tells you how you should act in such occasions. The famous verse which says that the Quran doesn't have contradictions, that's in verse 82, that's also in this passage. Now why is that mentioned here? Again, it's because at that time, during your movement, you will be able to experience the reading of the Quran in its proper form. So that's 71 to 93. Next we move on to verse 94 to 134, another long passage. Again, it begins with the believers' expeditions. So how the believers should establish salat during that period, and also obeying the messenger. So here we have another long discourse on how the believers' behavior should be during their travels. Next comes a single passage verse. So to me, single passage verses are meant for us to read and take it in. You know, so sort of like your attention is very strong at that point because it's single passage. You know, your attention doesn't drift. Verse 135 is such a passage. Another one is chapter 3, verse 200, which we mentioned yesterday. So verse 135, chapter 4, verse 135 is a single verse passage which says to establish justice even if it's against ourselves. So imagine where this verse is placed. It's placed right after a long exposition on the believers' movement. So that is the goal of the movement, to establish justice. Next we move on to verse 136 to 143, which talks about belief, iman, hypocrisy, and treating the word of God poorly. Why is the word of God mentioned here? You know, the verse which talks about those who mock the word of Allah, you're not supposed to sit with them. That's verse 142. That's also in here. And we should ask why it's there. The reason is, during the believers' movement, they will be spreading the word. Now this does not mean they'll only be spreading the Quran. Anything which moves towards Allah, the kalima. Yeah. Next is verse 144 to 169, which talks about taking non-believers as allies. Once again, this is not a religious thing. It is about people who act in a certain way, no matter what their religion is. This passage, interestingly enough, includes Quranic personalities like Musa and Isa. That would be in verse 155 to 160. Why are Musa and Isa mentioned here? Because the experiences of Musa and Isa relate to the theme of this chapter. So here Isa is mentioned. For example, they say that we killed Isa, and or we crucified him. And Allah said, no, by no means. You did not crucify him. Why is this mentioned here? And the reason is that Isa symbolizes the system of Allah. And there are some people, the hypocrites, which are mentioned in the previous passage, they wish to bring this down. So they say, we killed Isa. That's the symbolic meaning of this. So we come almost to the end now. It's verse 170. Once again, single verse passage. It starts with to mankind and says that the messenger has come. So once again, you are meant to sit still and accept this before your attention drifts. So that's how vital this passage is. Next, we have three verses, verse 171 to 173, which talk to the people of the book and tells them to not say three. So instead of these people actually dividing Allah, God, into three different personalities, they are meant to focus on only Allah. And that is done by believing and doing good, which is verse 173. Verse 174 to 175 talks about mankind and tells them the proof has come and they are meant to hold fast to Allah. Again, this repeats the sentiment in chapter 3 verse 103, which says وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا, which hold on to the rope of Allah strongly. So that's almost at the end. And then we come to verse 176, which could be part of 174 to 175, but also could not be. I'm not entirely sure at this point. But verse 176 talks about the distribution of wealth for the kalala, those who don't have anyone or those who are weary. I'm not entirely sure why this is here, but it is definitely meant to close off this chapter in some way. So there you have it. This chapter is a set of instructions on social organization, how believers are meant to organize themselves in order for the believers movement to become momentous, for it to begin its movement in the world. So that wraps up chapter 4, and I hope I haven't been taking up too much of your time, and I hope you benefited from this. Again, comments and criticisms most welcome. Thank you very much for your viewership. Bye.